Welcome back to CTI 120. This is John Armke, your instructor, and we're going to go over Chapter 2 of our introductory section on networks. So we're going to look at network infrastructure and documentation today. Now we've got some objectives to talk about. Identifying and describing network and cabling equipment in commercial buildings and work areas, which is a little bit different than what we would see in a small office or home office. Creating and analyzing network diagrams, explaining operating procedures, inventory management, labeling conventions, and business documents for typical network implementation. We're also going to look at what's called change management, our first exposure to change management, which is where we deal with how things change across the network and how we keep a record of that so that we can identify potential problems or areas of conflict. So TIA-EIA is a combined set of organizations. I believe EIA folded I want to say it's like February of 2016 or something similar. They're no longer an extant organization. They're largely absorbed by TIA, but we still refer to it as a joint venture, using what's called the 568 Commercial Building Wiring Standard. Now there are two different ways this can be configured, 568A and 568B. If we have 568A on both sides or B on both sides, we have what's called a patch cable. If we have alternating sides, where we have A on one side and B on the other, then we have what's called a crossover cable, which is something you'll talk about in more depth in Net 125. The standard that's implemented here is also known as structured cabling. This allows us to install networking media in a way that allows us to maximize performance, minimize upkeep, and ensure compatibility. And when I say ensure compatibility, that means that no matter what type of media it is, be it fiber optic, Wi-Fi, or copper, using different types of transmission technology or different network speeds, they will all be able to work together. Now this is based on a hierarchical design, so we have a kind of a reverse tree-like structure. Everything comes to kind of a pyramid-like point, and assumes that a network is based on the star topology. Now there may be instances where we see some other topologies where we involve things like mesh or what have you, but in general, we talk about star or star bus topologies. So here we can see a diagram of the structured cabling in a campus network that crosses three buildings, A, B, and C. We see the blue line in the middle at the top that says to ISP. Should also say just from ISP as well, but that is the delivery and exit point for information that is outside of our local control. The separation point is the little white box just below the blue line that says DMARC. The entrance facility, highlighted in red dots, is the place at which the next level of a network, if you will, is going to transition up or down. So we can see that the DMARC point is where the ISP transitions to what's called the MDF, or main distribution frame. And then we see similar markings around the entrance point of the IDF, or intermediate distribution frame, in each building. A main distribution frame handles the primary input of the network. That's usually where your main router is that connects to your ISP. Your IDF handles sub-infrastructure such as a secondary router or a switch. This type of structure allows better navigation and segmentation of the network to control local traffic. We see that the ISP line is marked in blue, and there are two other lines that come off the MDF marked in kind of a tan color that are identified as backbone connections. These are going to usually be high-speed serial connections. They may use fiber optic links or similar, whereas inside of a network building we would use in the IDF or MDF just a standard copper connection or maybe Wi-Fi. Here we can see a variation of this to where we're dealing with multiple floors in the same building. So here we have movement going up one floor or down in what's called a vertical cross connect. Now these are where we have multiple IDFs that are talking to one another to distribute information from an MDF at the entrance facility. Once we reach that IDF, we're then able to use what's called horizontal wiring to move from the IDF area into each individual workstation. So we may have a single connection that goes over and splits off into two pairs for a hub or something similar for an IP phone, for a printer, for a other network resource, or just a workstation. So the entrance facility, as I said, is just where the incoming network hooks up to the school or corporate network. The demarcation marks where our ISP service is going to end and our internal network begins. So the entrance facility and demarc point are generally at the same place. A data room is going to be an enclosed space that holds network equipment. It may be connected to the MDF, as described above, or it may be something that is segregated. There may be data closets on each floor of a building rather than just having one. When we talk about information technology, the infrastructure, it's generally in what we call rack-mounted form. Now, racks are these standardized size equipment holders. They're these platforms in which we bolt in things like routers, switches, server blades, things of that kind of equipment. They can also attach to what's called a patch panel. A patch panel can also be mounted to a wall or rack and will contain several data receptors, such as RJ45 Ethernet jacks. This provides a termination point where many patch cables can converge into a single location and connect to something like a router or switch much more easily. So here we have an example of an IDF that distributes information from an ISP to IDFs on campus, as well as direct workstation connections. So an MDF doesn't have to pass directly to an IDF in order to support an end user. Here we have a patch panel, and we can take a look at a couple of things in this photo. So we see that we've got all of our cables kind of zip tied here. Let me switch over to my laser pointer. We've got our mounting here to where we've got all of our leads that come from these what looks to be a 48 port patch panel coming back to this unit here. So we've gone ahead and got those connections together. We've got a platform rack to hold those cables so that we don't have extra weight on the jacks here. We've got reinforced grommeted screws that are mounted into the rack to hold it flush, make sure that it's anchored correctly. We see that we have these numerical markers. They're in ascending order, so you see they go from the bottom up, going from 39 to 40. Those are height markers. So if you're looking for individual items, we'll talk about this with cabling later, you can actually see, it might indicate, rack 1, position 39. Or it might say, row A, cabinet 1, rack 40, or something similar. So it just helps you to identify where something's located if we have a standardized height and width requirement. You can also see that there's labeling on the jacks themselves to indicate what the near and far end of each should be. We also may have what's called VoIP telephone equipment. VoIP is the use of any network to carry voice signals using TCP/IP. Now there are three things that we may identify as part of a VoIP network to help facilitate this transmission. A VoIP gateway, a VoIP PBX, which I believe is a phone box crossover or something similar to it, and then we have an endpoint, VoIP endpoint, so that's the actual device itself, like an IP phone. So in order to connect to a VoIP device, we have to have a filter set up. We have to be able to set off those particular frequencies for transmission so that we can treat them as data as opposed to as voice like we would traditionally do with a telephone line. The work area, quote unquote, is what encompasses all of our end devices on a floor. So whereas most of the wiring and stuff would be considered infrastructure, it'd be inside the walls or in a specific closed off area, the work area would be offices, normal workspace. A wall jack is generally just the little strike plate on the wall that you see that has the connectors. The TIA-EIA standard prior to, I want to say they changed it around 2010, but they may have continued it for certain things. But it says that they need to contain at least one voice and one data outlet. Now, in the event that your business uses a VoIP system, you may be allowed to use one data outlet that connects to a local workstation hub, or you may have two data connections that can work at that point. Because what we have to remember is that RJ45s and RJ11s are very similar, except for the fact that an RJ45 has twice as many contact leads inside and twice as many wires. So here we can see the structuring that we would use. So here if we have a telephone company, and then we connect to a VoIP gateway to convert from voice to data, and then moves internally, we would have a switch, which is then connected to the data devices for the endpoints. And then we have our VoIP PBX over here. In the case of the other system here, we have the ISP connecting to a switch. The VoIP gateway is on the other side of it. and then we have what's called a legacy PBX, and that's how we were able to connect to devices that are not IP phones. So you could have, one of those old clear, clamshell telephones with the curly Q cases and the neon lights hooked up to a VoIP system, because the PBX allows conversion between voice signals and data signals. And here we have an extended star topology. Remember how I said that we traditionally use the star topology to describe a network, at least under the structured cabling license. So we go from a central point to extended points branching off. The extended star is the same thing, except it's a star made of stars. So we see the MDF here in the middle. We see workstations and utilities directly attached, and then we see IDFs that branch off of each and have their own end devices as well. You could even have a secondary IDF that comes off of the first, but that's not considered a traditional connection method on the same floor. Now, if you have a vertical cross connect, it's a little bit different, because the wiring tends to run not quite the same. So remember I said that the data line is going to have twice as many connections as the voice. You can see it a little bit here in that the width of the connection is twice as wide. So it helps you to make sure that you're not plugging something into the wrong port. Rack systems. So here is some example of the various rack systems that we would deal with. So we see what are called open racks and enclosed racks. Enclosed racks are traditionally also called cabinets or cabinet racks. The two-post racks are a little bit smaller in terms of floor space requirements. So you just have this kind of T-shaped metal plate, an inverted T, if you will, and then you have anchor posts that are mounted to them, and they go straight up. And it's the same, 40 to 50 unit height that you would see for anything else. And then you have plastic enclosures that go across the front or across the sides to contain wiring, give you some place to anchor that wiring and keep it secured. In the four-post racks, the cabinets that you see here, these are generally for equipment that are a bit more sensitive to contamination. Maybe they don't have their own filtration or ventilation system. This is an enclosed space, kind of like the difference between having a laptop or a desktop. The laptop is a little bit more movable. It has its own filters and fans. Everything kind of can be shifted around more readily. This is for stuff that's not going to be moved around as often. So if we're going to use like a big, block style server, we probably want to anchor that this way. So that it's not messed with very often. This may also be in environments that have higher level of contaminants. So as I said before, if we have a 568A to 568A connection or 568B to 568B, we have what's called a patch cable. Patch cable is just a relatively short length of cabling with connectors at both ends that transmits between unlike devices. So if we go from a switch to a router or a switch to an end device, that will work. If we have the 568A on one side and B on the other, then we have a crossover, which communicates between like devices, so switch to switch or end device to end device. If you have a laptop or a desktop that you want to connect to without having infrastructure in the middle, creating an ad hoc network, you can do that with crossover. Horizontal cabling is what's running inside the walls and connects workstations to the closest data room and the switches therein. And then backbone cabling gives us the connections between MDFs as well as the entrance facility and IDFs. Now, the important thing to know about what we call horizontal cabling is that there is a limit of how long they can run. And we figure that to be about 100 meters, so 330 feet for the imperial among us. So here we see the data room. We have a connection that goes between one of those infrastructure units and the data jack. So it goes 90 meters in length at max. From the data jack to the workstation can be no more than 10 meters, so a little bit less than 33 feet. Usually they say 25 to 30 feet is the max you should do inside of a room. Just makes it a little bit easier. Once we go over 100 meters, we start seeing signal degradation. And the reason that we have a cross connect here, or a data closet infrastructure attachment point, is because the signal is able to be taken in, interpreted if necessary, and then regenerated. So we're absorbing the packet or frame, whichever layer we're dealing with at that point. We are adding or removing information as necessary to route traffic, and then we are passing it back onto its intended destination. So there should be, under structured cabling rules, unless we have very specific structures like fiber optic cables, which don't have the same problem, there should be no copper links that go more than 100 meters without some form of repeater system inside of a standard network. So here we have a traditional UTP cabling installation, UTP standing for unshielded twisted pair. The MDF slash entrance facility mark should be over here on the top left, feeding into a switch. The switch connects to a patch panel. Patch panel feeds through to another patch panel, which goes into the wall. Wall feeds through to the wall outlet, so that's our horizontal cabling in this case. And then we get to the patch cable that goes from the wall jack to the work area. So that just gives you a general idea of how we go from the ISP to your end device in a very simple step. So as I said, unshielded twisted pair cables, or UTP, are probably the most common we see for local wired networks. There is also what's called STP, or shielded twisted pair, which instead of just using plastic jacketing here, also adds a foil jacket to keep the wires internally contained. You see that there's a little bit of a difference between the left hand, right hand, and middle cables. The ones on the outside are a little bit darker. The one on the far right, the Cat6, has a plastic core in the middle to help further separate the bundles of wire inside. And then the one in the middle is kind of a lighter color, and it says plenum grade as opposed to PVC grade. PVC, or polyvinyl chloride, is a type of plastic that when burned emits a toxic smoke. Toxic smoke is very much something you want to avoid if you are a remotely carbon-based life form. So we instead use what's called plenum graded cable, because plenum is the space between the ceiling of one room and the floor of the next in a multi-story building, or if you're just talking about the space between the ceiling and the roof or an attic. In the event of a fire, when that burns, it will not generate toxic smoke, and it's also a little bit more fire resistant for the majority. Now, because it is a specialized material, it is more expensive to make. So plenum rated cable should be specifically run for things that require it, not for every entry. Whenever we're terminating twisted pair cabling, meaning we're trimming off the ends to insert it into a head to go into a jack, don't leave more than 1 inch of exposed cable before a termination. This will weaken the cable, make it much more susceptible to slippage of the jacket, as well as interference at that end. So if it's, we have what's called NEXT and FEXT, near end and far end crosstalk, the X meaning cross. So whenever you're dealing with crosstalk of this type, the less exterior jacketing you have, the further that termination point sticks out, the less protected you are. We also want to make sure that when we're dealing with cable, we want to avoid exceeding the prescribed bend radius. So this bend radius is a representation of the maximum arc into which you can loop a cable without causing its transmission to be impaired. So for things like copper cable, for the most part, the bend radius is very loose, very flexible. Now, you shouldn't put too much stress on it because repeated bends and things like that can cause fracturing of the interior leads. Very much something you do not want to have with structured cabling. There is no bend radius with Wi-Fi, obviously, because there's no physical cable. And then with fiber optics, there is a very limited bend radius because the internal fibers are very, very thin. And even though they are in what's called a jacket as well as cladding, it's very thick padding, sometimes a gel, sometimes layers and layers of thin plastic. Once you bend it beyond a certain point, it will snap. You may also have an issue to where the light impulses in fiber optic will start to bounce backwards. You have what's called refraction that goes through, and sometimes you can have a reflection that bounces back. You want to use cable testers to verify continuity to make sure that cables are not damaged and that each segment is transmitting data reliably. Cinch your cables loosely, so if you look back at the rack, you'll see that the cables are looped together, but it's not compressing it down so tightly that you see the jackets getting dented or squeezed into a highly compressed position. It just keeps them kind of grouped. In certain cases, if they can afford it, they'll often use something like Velcro to be able to have a reusable cable management system. Just because it's a lot easier than working with zip ties. You can loosen them a little bit more easily and be able to replace the cable with a lot less stress. If you're passing cables across a floor or an area where people will be traversing, we want to make sure that these types of cables are avoided if possible. Run it through the ceiling as opposed to over a floor if you can, or under the floor in certain cases, or use a cord cover. So make sure that you can keep the edges of whatever that may be flush, so that if it does catch a foot, it just kind of passes over. You can go over to Lowe's or Home Depot, sometimes even places like Walmart, and pick these cable covers up on the cheap. They are essentially just a little speed bump shaped piece of plastic, and on the interior of them, they're pretty rigid from vertical pressure, but they flex okay, moving around certain areas. You go ahead and bend them. You flip them over, you bend them apart, spread them like you're cracking a stick of celery. Put your cables in there. Go ahead and feed them through. Make sure the edges are nice and flat, and then either tack them down or use adhesive to attach them to the floor in question so they don't move. And it just provides a nice smooth surface. Sometimes you'll see them use what are called cord snakes for the same reason. So not corn snakes like the animal, but cord snakes that run over the opening of a garage or something similar in the case of running an extension cord or things like that. So just something to be aware of. Avoid trip hazards. Of course, avoid EMI, electromagnetic interference, or ESD, electrostatic discharge, for the same reasons. We don't want to have network equipment near energized equipment that uses really strong levels of voltage and amperage. If there's a high level of current, there's possibility that it's actually radiating a certain level of electromagnetic interference. So things like a washer dryer with a big motor, older cathode ray tube televisions, air conditioners, fluorescent lights. These are things that generate interference. And if you're not using shielded cable, it can be very inconvenient for you because you'll get a lot of signal garbling. Make sure your cable sheath is plenum rated if, this is something that they left out from the Cengage notes, if it is supposed to be run in a plenum space. Just a patch cable doesn't necessarily need to be plenum rated, but if it's a big backbone cable or something that's running between two buildings, that needs to be indoor-outdoor certified. If it's running between floors, it needs to be plenum rated. If it's running through an area of high interference, that's when you use that shielded twisted pair. Cabling is environment or contextually sensitive. We want to make sure that we're providing the best possible connectivity. So if we need to use a thicker or more robust cable, we need to do that as part of our planning process when we're doing our infrastructure design. We also want to pay attention to grounding requirements. We want to make sure that all of our equipment is correctly grounded. There may be a little bolt or screw that you anchor, and it comes. It's so funny. You get these wires, and they come with little green screws to let you know that they're supposed to be connected to a ground line, and then that ground line will be anchored to a piece of infrastructure that will allow dispersal of any surges without causing the equipment any damage. When you're doing your cable runs and moving them from point to point, it is recommended that you leave some slack in them. So, if you have to run something that goes the full 330 feet, you're definitely wanting to think about, why am I doing it this way? Is there a way I could do it in which I would involve a type of cable that could go much further? Whereas, copper cabling cuts out at about 330 feet before it starts losing signal. You can run kilometers without a repeater for fiber optics. You can run a very, very long distance because light pulses, of course, are much more robust in terms of transmission than electrical impulses. Use cable management devices such as cable trays, those black things we saw on the front of the racks. Braided sleeving. Sometimes you'll see this kind of fishnet style pattern on certain types of cables, especially with modern power supplies. That kind of sleeving is reinforced in order to give it a little bit more thickness and a little bit more strength. With the braided sleeving, it's just basically like putting it inside of a standard rope where it's woven together. So it's going to have a natural shape that it tries to return to, so it's not really floppy and constantly trying to weigh itself down. And also you can use furniture grommets. A grommet is a reinforced metal opening or ring in a piece of fabric or something similar. So if you go and get like a tarp to go camping, or to cover up the back of a pickup truck, things like that, those little metal holes where you would clip in the bungee cords, those are grommets. They're mounted into the fabric so that way they don't cause snags, runs, or other damage to the cloth, but they allow you to anchor them firmly. Furniture grommets allow you to tether things like to a desk. In our CTS 120/220 classroom in NB 229, we have desks that have a hollow leg in the back right corner that allow you to run cabling down from the desk. So that's kind of a very particular kind of grommet that would allow passage of cabling from an upper to lower location or interior to exterior. It keeps you from having to drill holes in the wall or wrap things around a piece of furniture. Speaking of organization, of course, we want to make sure that we use patch panels effectively to organize and connect lines. So where possible, we want to be able to have things in one consolidated area so we can troubleshoot things much more effectively, and we can prevent having to run from one location to another to fix any potential issues. Use company standards and stock. So this is kind of a weird term. It doesn't immediately make sense, but if a company has a particular standard for how they do things, and it's not malfunctioning, it is often very difficult to make an argument to change everything in an infrastructure situation. Now let's say that you are a larger company that has acquired a smaller one, or there's some kind of merger going on. There may be situations where you can do what's called a graduated transition, where, you know, like one room at a time, one floor at a time or something, you'll come in and you'll replace the infrastructure in certain ways. And usually it doesn't mean that you're actually pulling any new wires, except for in cases of very old buildings. It may just mean that you're changing labeling, or that you're, you know, removing, you know, heads of cables that are a little bit damaged or starting to wear out and replacing them with something a bit more robust. Because you don't want to waste resources like that, but you want to make sure you use the same kind of cable that they're currently employing. You want to make sure you use the same conventions for how you bundle things, how you label them, how you run them, things like that. You don't want to come in and make it haphazard, because then it's very difficult to troubleshoot. If you have somebody who runs cable vertically versus running them horizontally, it can become difficult to try and track down where a break may be if you have a continuity problem. Documentation, of course, you always want to have documentation in anything you do in IT. Keep your cable plant documentation accessible, meaning that it's the written paperwork or printed paperwork that talks about what type of cable equipment you're using, what kind of physical cable, what type of heads, what type of jacks, you know, so you can reorder things and make sure that they work with what you have. It's kind of like going and trying to buy a light bulb. If you buy the wrong wattage, you're either going to have something that's way too bright or way too dim. So you want to make sure that you're fitting the needs of that particular implementation. Label every jack, every port, every patch panel, and every connector. You don't ever want to say to yourself, well, I'll remember, or I'll look it up, because it may be that, you know, you get promoted and you go work at home office instead of being in a branch, you know, and then you're not the one working on it anymore, and somebody behind you has to come in and be able to troubleshoot these things. So documentation is absolutely key. There are cases in which you can use color-coded documentation on the cable itself, to where the cable's external jacket is a particular color. 606B, I believe, is the current standard that we use for most of that stuff in order to identify, you know, vertical cross connects or things passing from an IDF to an MDF, or workstation cables, or horizontal cabling we'd use inside the walls, fiber optics, things like that. Update your documentation as you make changes to the network. These documents should be considered living. So cabling documentation should be something that is not, you know, printed and bound into this, you know, hardcover book that sits and gathers dust in a drawer somewhere. It should be in a relatively tough, you know, 3-ring binder. It should be reviewed at least annually, making sure that any updates that have been implemented have been documented correctly. Now, there may be things where you have like a page that you fill out stuff in pen, and then at the end of the year they type everything into the current version and say, okay, this is what was done, this is the final version as of now. So now for 2021, you know, because we're in September, so we're coming up on the last 3 months, last 90 days of 2020, we're going to be oh, I'm sorry, that would be the end of this month, but we're coming in the last 120 days, last 100 days of 2020. So a lot of companies are reaching a point where they're like, okay, we need to start doing our year-end stuff so that we can have our documentation ready for January. Now, not every company follows the calendar year. Sometimes they follow a fiscal year, but the principle is the same. You have that end-of-year review, that quarter 4, to where you're sitting there and going, okay, these are the changes we've made. We need to go ahead and print out fresh copies, archive the changes we've made, and then shred whatever is not necessary to keep. So documentation is important, but it's also important to make sure that we have that that living update. You know, if something's not working, you know, cross it out, write in the update, and continue from there. Now, make sure you're not just changing things just to change them, because change management is dependent on having a predictable sense of updates, and it also has to follow a chain of command. Now, to monitor a data closet or an MDF or even an IDF, you have to be aware of how much heat you're generating. There's a lot of electricity passing through impure silicon, so there's a lot of waste heat that's generated at that point. There's a lot of resistors, capacitors, things like that. So these data rooms are often serviced by HVAC systems that are separate from the rest of the building. They may be more powerful, they may be directly vented to the exterior of the building, they may be set up to where there's a different filtration system, could be anything. Specialized products can also monitor the critical factors of a data closet, such as not just the temperature, which of course is a critical one, but humidity. Imagine that you have a very humid environment. Let's say we live in, Tallahassee, Florida, and we have a very humid environment outside. If it's very warm outside and very cold inside, there's going to be a lot of surfaces on which condensation can occur. So humidity would be something we'd want to be very aware of. Airflow conditions. Let's say that we have to work on a facility that's in the middle of South Dakota. Very cold, lots of things that will ice over. So we want to make sure that we're still drawing in plenty of fresh air from outside if we can, or if not, we need to make sure if it is a closed air environment that it's filtered and there's a lot of air movement to keep the temperature from becoming stagnant. Every data room should be locked, and only a select contingent of IT personnel should have the keys. You want to make sure that data closets and things like that are very easy to troubleshoot in terms of somebody's gaining access, what's the problem? You don't want that to be a really long list. Security cameras are of course suggested, as well as multi-factor authentication in other ways. You may have a thumbprint scanner or an ID swipe in addition to a personal passcode. There's a ton of things we'll talk about in the security section beyond just basic, having a metal key, which anybody can hold on to. Having up-to-date and detailed documentation of your network is essential because it makes things more efficient. Not just communication with your coworkers, but communicating with your future self. A lot of people don't think about this, but human memory is not great for retaining little niggling details about stuff. So what often is the case is you write yourself a note. If you're a programmer, you write it into your documentation. So if you're communicating with anybody, including, like I said, your future self, having things written down helps to remove ambiguity, helps to prevent you having to sit and think about, goodness, did I use this standard or this standard? Did we change this cable over? If it's written down, you know exactly what went down, rather. It makes it easier to verify things. It also speeds up troubleshooting efforts, because if we know we're following a certain standard, then that means that we have a list of changes that says this was done, this was done, this was done. And if we follow the steps and say, okay, well, based on what I'm reading, everything's fine, what's the problem? Then we have to think about, okay, who may not have documented? Or is there something that wasn't written in the documentation that should be? Or what can we troubleshoot, that's not procedural, it's actually physical? Can we check for damage? Things like that. When we're facing problems more than once, and this is something that you'll run into in any industry, but especially in IT, certain problems crop up annually. It's like growing cabbages. You have your harvest every year. It seems like, at the beginning of the summer, when everybody's, trying to take off for vacation, all of a sudden things are going wrong because people didn't close out tickets, or people didn't sign off on things that they should have, or there was a project that needed to get done. Now the person's not going to be back for 2 weeks. And your mileage may vary. Different businesses have different ways of operating, but in general, you're going to face the same types of problems over and over and over again, because that's just the nature of business. So it's important to have a what we call a knowledge base, or a body of research that you can look over and say, oh, well, this is what we had last time when it was manifesting these symptoms. It's probably the same hardware. Let's go ahead and try the solution from last time and see if that fixes it. So something else that's helpful in our documentation as well as in our design process is what's called a network diagram. Network diagrams are just graphical representations of how things are laid out, how they're connected, and what devices are involved. You can see what's called either a physical or logical topology, the IP address pool. When we set up what's called DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, you have a range of IP addresses that are established as being assignable to new devices when they're added in. So dynamic IP addresses have to fit that range. It doesn't just decide it itself. You have to tell it, I want to start at this address and work my way up to this address. And it may be a very long list, or it may be a very small one. There's some filtering that can be done in order to make a network more secure by limiting the number of dynamic IPs that can be assigned. We also have the names of major devices, as well as the types of transmission media that may be present. So let's say that we have 2 routers between two different buildings. We have the the sandbox on one, and then we have the standard production environment on the other, and they're connected via a high-speed serial connection or fiber optics. That would be helpful to identify for troubleshooting purposes, especially if we're having two devices that can't communicate. Let's say that the network translation going from one router to the next isn't working. That would be a big red flag if we're saying, okay, all of our traffic locally seems to work, but when we try and move out of that network between these two, boom, big problem. Network mapping is the process of discovering and identifying devices on a network. This is extremely helpful for stuff like rogue devices, things that may not have been added in by IT staff. So Nmap, one of the most popular ones for network mapping, so guess where the N comes from. And then there's what's called ZenMap. ZenMap is just the GUI alternative to Nmap to allow you to try and find different devices on a network. You can do it through a GUI, and you can point and click rather than having to type stuff out in command line. Now, because command line tends to be a lot more precise, I find Nmap a lot more appealing, but that doesn't mean that, ZenMap doesn't have its benefits, being able to just point, click, get what you need, and run the scan. Cisco Systems is the organization that has set what many consider to be the standard for diagram symbols that are used to represent network devices. So here we have Nmap outputting in command prompt. We can see that we've got the standard prompt nmap-t4-f, and then we have an IP range, so 192.168.2.1 through 254. So that covers every address in the 192.168.2 subnet except for 0 and 255, because those are the network and broadcast addresses. So Nmap starts up, starts scanning. It says the host is up. It reads what latency speed it's going at for this particular IP address. We can see that 96 ports are listed as filtered because of how we set up, our arguments here. And then we can see what they're resolving as. We can see what service it is and whether or not it's open, and then the number of the port. We can also see the MAC address for that particular device. So we're going to obviously blank that out because MAC addresses are global. This MAC address would not be reassignable. And then you can see it continues below. We started with 2.113. She's also got 2.178 that's being scanned. We may see things all the way up into the 250s. And the same thing, we're looking at ZenMap graphical instead of seeing it in a command line instead. We can see the different hosts that are popping up. So obviously we got to 113, then there's 154, 163, 178, 184, and 200 on the left-hand side. And then we can filter out specific hosts. We can change, how we want the scan to operate regarding specific services. Let's say we want to see who has an open HTTP port right now. So who's doing port 80? We could set our filtration for that as well. So this is a diagram using some Cisco symbols, and thankfully they're all labeled nice and pretty. The cloud is kind of a useful, acceptable symbol for the nebulous nature of the internet. We can see a brick wall for a firewall just to the right of that. The router, which shows as a cylinder topped with arrows for inter-network traffic. Intra-network traffic is handled by the switch, which is very similar to the router, except it has back and forth on a vertical only, or I'm sorry, horizontal only, whereas horizontal and vertical is involved with the router. The wireless access point has two overlapping sine waves in order to indicate wireless transmission. And then we have end devices that are pretty simple. The workstation shows like a tower, a monitor, and a keyboard. Laptop just shows an unfolded device. Web server usually has a globe on it to indicate. File server is just a standard tower. Printer would be a big blocky laser printer. If you go into Packet Tracer, you'll see quite a bit of these items being presented. Network diagrams provide broad snapshots of a network's physical or logical topology. This is very useful when we're trying to figure out where to put in a new switch. Let's say if we're trying to set up a new data room or something similar, we need to know how all of these things work together. The wiring schematic eliminates worrying about how the devices are playing, but where every wire is in order to connect those devices. So you would just put in a block that says router, and you would show where each wire goes in order to describe the wiring schematic. Rack diagrams, these show devices stacked in a rack system. So you would see just kind of a vertical kind of rectangle that would show the different layers of a rack where something might be positioned. You'd have a UPS down at the bottom or similar. So here we see a wiring schematic. This gives us a little bit more detail than some might do, but we can still see the hierarchy. We see that the WAN entrance and exit is up here in the top near the right. We see that we've got 4 switches. We've got one for the primary switch going to the WAN. We've got one going over here to our print and file server. We've got one going to our wireless router down here. We've got one going to a set of workstations and another going to a secondary switch that connects to our VoIP system. Now these may physically all be in the same room. They may be very close to one another. You may have workstation 1 and 2 on the same desk as phones 1 and 2. It just depends. The wiring diagram isn't trying to tell us where it is physically. It just tries to show us the logical flow of information moving from one point to the next. And then the rack device, the diagram would show you where various things are. Now they would probably still need to be labeled with text or with some kind of encoding, because if you're looking at it just in general, you see a bunch of rectangles. You don't see a lot of detail. But again, it's just a rough configuration to show you, okay, this down at the bottom should be the UPS. Let's go ahead and match it with the inventory tag or whatever we have. So for our operating procedures, we usually need some essential documentation established. Physical and logical connections on a network, how it's read on the network versus how it's seen physically. Inventory management, we got to keep track of what we have. What IP addresses have been established, which have not. Vendors, if we have a vendor agreement to say that, we need to resupply whenever we get below a certain percentage, or we allow access to certain inventory for a vendor to be able to replenish, things like that. Internal operating procedures, policies, and standards. I've had questions before about what the difference is between a policy and a standard. A standard is something that everybody agrees on. Like every company is like, don't steal our stuff, don't light the building on fire. Policies, on the other hand, would be, any access to room 265 requires authentication by at least 2 members of senior staff, refer to list, 540B, something similar. So policies are company specific. Standards are pretty much considered universals. And then we have what are called guidelines. Guidelines are just suggestions. It's not a rule, it's not on paper, but it's how we've always done it, sort of thing. Inventory management is handled through what's called the SLC, the process of designing, implementing, and maintaining a network. So the life cycle deals with, this was our initial implementation, this is how we keep it running. When something goes sour, we need to go ahead and replace it or expand it or contract it. SLC means that we add and remove devices as they are needed. We have to make sure the devices that are added are compatible and that outdated assets are retired within the terms of what requires us to perform basic security maintenance. Inventory management is keeping track of all of our assets, as you might imagine, and this allows us to simplify the process of maintaining our network. If we know what we have, let's say that we have a big inventory of Catalyst 2960 switches that we use, and they have a major security update that comes through. Well, we know that we've got a switch in rooms 1, 6, 11, and 22. So we go through to those 4 rooms and make sure those updates are approved and that they're processed correctly. And we don't have to worry about, well, I thought we had a 5th one. Well, if we are maintaining our inventory correctly, that's not something we should have to sit and guess about. It also provides network administrators with information about cost-benefit analysis for replacing certain types of hardware or software or maintaining it, especially for certain types of infrastructure devices. In order to keep receiving updates, there may be a licensing fee or similar. For labeling and naming, it is recommended that we use names that are as descriptive as possible. We wish to include fields that are essential in identifying the device, but not anything that's just superfluous. We don't want to have to fill in a bunch of, zeros or X's where information that would not be relevant to the device is put on the label. Don't overcomplicate the name. Use established naming conventions where possible. Again, refer to the 606B standard for that. If you Google 606B cabling standard, you'll often see a pretty good number of pretty good number of web articles that talk to you about how to implement it depending on the size of your company, or how do you deal with compensations for people who might be colorblind, or how big do your labels need to be, blah, 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 blah. This step is one that kind of throws people on occasion. Think big picture down to details. The way I learned it when I was taught this initially is called top down. So that means that we want to look at the business as a whole and then work our way down to the details. Some people prefer to do what's called bottom up, where you start with little bitty details and then you aggregate them. The problem is, if you start with the tiny details, it becomes very difficult to make sure that they're contained within the framework of what you need for the big picture. If you say this is what we're going to do and you set the big box, then obviously if you bump into a wall, you know, okay, this is exceeding the scope of what we need to carry out. Consider security risks from details included in your naming convention. If you're identifying what a particular device is with your naming convention, make sure it's not something that's going to allow someone to try and manipulate or otherwise compromise that device. Color-coded cables if possible. Again, that can be costly in certain instances. You know, some people will use bands of electrical tape at the end of a cable to identify what it's supposed to be, as opposed to the jacket color itself. Cable tags to identify each cable's purpose, of course, should be a good choice. Cable tags can be difficult, though, because you have to get something that's either very sturdily adhesive and not susceptible to temperature changes, so very specific types of label makers. Label the ports and jacks that cables connect to. So we want to not only label our media, but we want to label our infrastructure devices as well. If I have a switch that is used to separate out IP phones as well as printers, desktops, whatever else, I want to make sure that I am making that clear on the device, so I'm not sitting there going like, okay, we need to unplug all the IP phones on this floor because we need to be able to reset them. We got to reboot them. And then you accidentally unplug the web server because you don't check the labeling. You just say, oh, well, everything from port 1 to 6, right? And you're not checking the labeling to make sure, hey, this got moved. And again, that's why we talk about the documentation being a living list of things that are going on. Where labels won't fit, let's go ahead and just draw a simple diagram and indicate where each port is used. You know, the rack diagram we looked at a little bit ago wasn't very helpful without the labels, but with the labels it was like, oh, this is the basic rundown of what I'm going to see. And then, you know, a portable label maker is handy. Make sure the labels are durable and they're designed to stick to plastic and metal. If they have an adjustable font size, that one's pretty handy. I have a Dymo that does exactly that. It uses a heat-cured thermal transfer style label, and then you can up the font size if necessary to make it more readable for certain areas, or you can make it smaller if you're trying to fit a certain amount of information into a confined space. I definitely prefer printed labels to any kind of written label, especially because my handwriting is atrocious. So here we can see labels on the ports themselves, as well as we can see little tags on the cable as well as on the heads. Now this is not the cleanest job I've seen. There are definitely some that are a lot more I would say aesthetically pleasing, but the functionality is still there. So we can see up here that we can see some like, I can't see what that, I think that might say jumpers to C223 or port E774 or 775, depending on where you're looking. If we look at figure 232, we see a diagram of a router with red labels identifying how 5 ports are used. So we can see slot 0, the EWIC slot there, is going to a WAN connection, so that's probably the gigabit interface. And then we can see the Ethernet connections for 1 through 4, where they connect to various departments. Some other documents that we may encounter, a little bit less involved with IT, but definitely things that we'll see in the business world that may be related, would be things like the RFP, the MOU, and the SOW. The RFP, or request for proposal, is where we send a request to vendors to submit a proposal for a product or service we want to purchase. So you'll hear this sometimes referred to as making a bid. So if we have a project that we want to have carried out, we contact companies that can provide that service or product, and we say, hey, this is what we're looking for. This is about what we're looking to spend. What you got? You know, and whoever comes in with the best price or best value for money, we then select from. Memorandum of Understanding. This is going to document the intentions of 2 or more parties to enter into a binding agreement or contract. And the SOW, or Statement of Work, is going to be a detailed manifest of the work that has to be completed for a particular project to be signed off. Now, the detail involved in that SOW may change based on your industry, but in general, it talks about this is the man hours it's going to take, this is what kind of product we're going to need, this is the amount of time it may impact the business running. If we want to turn things on or off during a certain time, we can only have people coming in during the hours of darkness, that sort of thing. You may also see what's called an SLA, an MSA, or an MLA. The SLA, or Service Level Agreement, is a legally binding contract or part of a contract that defines the aspects of a service. So it gives you the details of, let's say your ISP, if you're with Spectrum, how fast is your internet connection going to be? What is the protocol if your service isn't working? The MSA, Master Service Agreement, defines the terms of future contracts, such as payment terms or arbitration. In the event that this goes bad, how do we handle it? Or if we're paying on installments, how much is due per installment, what's the late penalty, etc. The MLA, Master License Agreement, allows licensing of an intellectual property to a third party for the purposes of sub-licensing, distributing, or marketing. So think about when you go to the dollar store, or if you go to Party City or things like that, and you want to go buy some balloons for a kid's party, and the balloons have Batman printed on them, or have the bat symbol, or otherwise what we would consider to be licensed indicia from DC Comics. Now, DC does not own a plant that I'm aware of to fabricate these things. Instead, they contact a company that produces latex or mylar balloons, and they give them a license to stamp these items with their particular intellectual property, and in exchange for using their facilities, they get a cut of the profits. They split the profits and saying, okay, this product is going to sell for $5 for a pack of 20 balloons or something similar, and we will give you 25% for your production. We'll handle the shipping, we'll handle the distribution, all that stuff. We just want you to print the balloons themselves. And they may have multiple contracts of the same thing. They may have somebody doing the packaging, somebody doing the actual products themselves. They may have somebody else who's printing up the inserts that goes with it, if there is such a thing that goes on. So it's important to understand that not everything is always going to be done in-house. Certain companies like Lego are very famous for only doing things in-house, to where all of the packaging and fabrication is done internally and then is sent out. If you want proof of this, if you look at the difference between the Lego kits that are produced in the US versus the UK, some of them will have a sticker on the front that tells you what the piece count is in the US, how many pieces are in the box, because that's not required in the UK. So if they have a set that was predominantly designed and distributed for the UK market, they won't sell it with the piece count on it, but if they sell it in the US, they have to sell it with the piece count. Change management. This is managing change, which is, I normally despise defining a term by using the same term in a different order, but we are controlling the rate of change and the extent of change while maintaining efficiency and availability to a network. We have to have good planning. We have to set expectations. If you go to a doctor's office and you have an appointment at 9, you come in 10 minutes early, you check in, they go ahead and get you sat down, you got your forms all filled out. 9 o'clock comes, nothing. 9:15, nothing. 9:30, nothing. 9:45, you actually get up and go to the desk and say, what's going on? I was supposed to be done by now. My appointment was 45 minutes ago. And it's like, oh, well, the doctor's running a little bit late, and she'll probably be here in another 20 minutes, or, he'll be here, in 10 minutes, like whatever you want to say, whatever their response is. And at that point, you're incandescent, because you're like, I've been sitting here for 45 minutes doing nothing. You could have told me that. I could have rescheduled, or I could have gone and got something to eat, or come back, things like that. Because that's the one investment that we can't recoup, right, is time. On the other hand, if we had somebody set the expectation at the beginning saying, the doctor's coming in from, like, let's say you live here in Wilmington and they live in Hampstead, if they're coming from their home and they know they're already, half an hour behind and they're going to be hitting traffic, they can give you that understanding at the beginning. You'd be disappointed, but far less disappointed than you would if you had not been told. So setting that expectation is important. If people come in and they say, okay, we've got that big project we've got to get done for so-and-so company, let's go ahead and buckle down and get it done, and then on Wednesday or whatever it is that they start doing it, the network's going down. They've got a planned maintenance thing where they're like, yeah, it's going to be down for like 6 hours. If they had known that, maybe they would have done some more work on it on Monday or Tuesday, or maybe they would have gone to an alternate site, maybe they would have rescheduled the maintenance, any number of things. So change management is all about communication, transparency, and good planning. Some common changes we may deal with would be things like installing patches, replacing a cable, rebooting a server. It may go all the way up to replacing the entire network backbone for connections between two IDFs or an MDF to an IDF. So it's a very broad spectrum. We may also need to know the type of change documentation that's needed for an enterprise scale network. Now that will usually have been written well before you become involved, and it's something that you kind of inherit. When you're writing change management documentation, it's usually for a much smaller business. So there are 4 different types of software changes we'll traditionally see: a patch, an upgrade, a rollback, or a new installation. A patch is just a basic correction. An upgrade usually incorporates multiple patches or has some form of major change involved. A rollback, also known as downgrading or backleveling, is going back to a previous version after attempting a patch. Companies like Apple are traditionally going to not release a downgrade, but instead will release another upgrade which performs the downgrade for you. So that way there's never a situation where a device is allowed to move back to a previous version of itself. Keeps people from being able to reclaim a feature that might have been removed by Apple's corporate direction. Then, of course, installation seems pretty self-explanatory. That's when we put new things into the network, be they software or hardware. Hardware changes could include things like new security cameras, new hard drives, changing what type of hard drives might be present, replacing workstations, installing new printers, just general hardware upgrades, putting in a new monitor. You never know. To reverse a software upgrade, there's usually 4 different methods. There's what's called a patch uninstall, which is normally automatic. Like if the patch fails, it'll go ahead and try and clear up whatever pieces it was trying to use. Client software will often have a reversion or rollback tactic. Shared application upgrade may require that there's kind of a dummy installation. We go ahead and have 2 versions of the same software installed. We install one. If it's seen to work, then we approve it. If not, we roll back to the older version that's kept in the other location. Operating system upgrades, which are pretty large compared to the others we've described. We're going to make a complete backup of the system, and then if we need to roll back afterwards, if the upgrade fails, we can go ahead and restore the entire system from the backup. It is never recommended to uninstall an operating system upgrade because there may be aspects of that upgrade that can negatively impact stuff that you would need to retain. The same change management principles will apply to any type of change. We always want to make sure that we follow the correct documentation and channels so that way we get a proposal, an approval, etc. We want to minimize negative impacts of business procedures, be that timing, doing what's called a staggered implementation or staggered rollout, and plan thoroughly to maximize our changes to get a successful change on the first attempt. If we have good planning, it is hoped, dearly hoped, that we are able to be successful in our changes rather than having to make an adjustment after the fact. And as we're working through the process, just like we would if we were doing, a repair on a desktop or something, document as you work. Make sure that you have an idea of what the workflow is before you start, and make sure you maintain adherence to that workflow as you proceed. Generally, the larger an organization is, the more documentation that's needed, but that's because you're often affecting way more stuff, if you will. So if you're doing an operating system upgrade for 10 computers, that requires a little bit of work. If you're doing it for 1,500 computers, that's a much more extensive process, requires a lot more validation and a lot more planning. The required process will vary, but here's some things we can expect. Submit the request, because there will be a process of approval or rejection. Understand and follow how the approval process works, and see that if there is an appeals process or a revision process. The change should be managed, meaning that there should be a coordinator of some kind to make sure that we know this is where we started, this is where we want to go, these are the steps in between. And then if necessary, there's additional documentation that may be needed. Things like network configurations, how things are set up, which IP addresses will be needed or affected, any additions or removals to or from the network, and any changes of physical location. If we're taking a multifunction printer and we're taking it from the second floor to the third floor, or we're moving it from the second floor break room to the second floor storeroom, if we're moving it to the different places on the same floor or on a different floor, that needs to be communicated. Because if somebody has to go use the multifunction printer or use whatever else, and that item is not there, it's definitely going to slow down their day trying to ask, everybody, hey, where'd they move the printer? Not something we want to deal with. Once we've got the change completed, and we've got our documentation updated, then we close out the change and make sure that the documentation is going to be reflecting the new status quo. That is chapter 2. So if you have any questions or concerns, of course, you can always contact me via email, my Google Voice number, or of course you can send me a message directly through Blackboard, things like that. Feel free to send me comments for things of improvement or areas where maybe the recording was a little scratchy. I always welcome hearing from you guys, so hopefully this was instructive. If you have any issues that you need to address with me immediately, I look forward to hearing from you. If not, I'll see you in class.